And I want to welcome you all today. We're pleased to have you here. Those of you who have not been to one of our Foro Urgentes before, it's a program we have of sort of contemporary, of-the-moment, sort of rapid response programs using mainly local experts, but also bringing in a few other people to talk about current events in contemporary Latin America. And certainly, I don't know that anything is more sobresaliente than this current situation in Venezuela. So, as I say, I'm sure more people will continue to come in, but I think we'll just go ahead and start in a timely manner. The organizer and moderator of this is Kurt Whalen, who is faculty here at UT Austin. He is the Mike Hogue Professor in Liberal Arts in the Department of Government here at UT, which for every place else is political science, but here it's government. He holds his PhD in political science from Stanford University, and his research interests include democratization and authoritarian rule, social policy and policy diffusion, and populism, timely topic, in Latin America and Europe. His publications include The Politics of Market Reform in Fragile Democracies, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela, which is published by Princeton in 2002, and Making Waves, Democratic Contention in Europe and Latin America Since the Revolutions of 1848, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, as well as many articles and chapters. So Kurt will introduce our other guests, but I'll turn the non-microphone over to him.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the organization. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about the Venezuelan crisis and potential collapse and all these things. They asked me to be the moderator here, which should be very easy to ask because I don't see many radicals, so it shouldn't be hard to keep things under control. I think the reason why they appointed a German to be the moderator is that I'm supposed with cards like this to prevent the faculty here from falling prey to the typical professorial temptation of going on and on and on and on, so that you people here in the audience also get an opportunity to ask questions and chime into this debate. And the nature of these debates is usually we as scholars, we impose this self-discipline on us to be neutral and objective, and so occasionally we can cut loose a bit at these kinds of photos and be a little more provocative. And so clearly the topic for today is important and provocative because, essentially what we're discussing is two very important issues. One is what do we make of this Bolivarian political and economic model? The current crisis, is it just a result of kind of bad administration the last couple of years, or is it the result of inherent structural flaws? And then second, given that the crisis is so bad, the big open question is, can we imagine any kind of exit, any kind of solution, any way out of this? And so that's essentially kind of what will inform us here this afternoon. So the panelists, one other benefit of being the moderator is you get to determine the sequence of people who talk. So everybody else is ahead of me in the alphabet, so I don't have to do much work because they are going to do all the work. And we'll start with Andrea Clark, who is a master's student here at the University of Texas from Venezuela. And she has done a number of things, like being in the graduate program in public policy at the Archer Center in Washington, D.C., and being a Mellon Mace undergraduate fellow. And so she's done a number of studies on ethnographic work in Nicaragua and Venezuela on race, ethnicity, and women's sexual and reproductive rights. She's also involved in the Plan País program, where young people from Venezuela try to discuss and see, are there any ways of pulling the country out of its problems. So, Andrea, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. And it'll start when I get there.
Yes. We're not quite that quick.
I'll do a plug if anyone is interested in Plan País, especially the youth in the room. I'm free to talk more about it. But I wanted to start in kind of what many have correctly titled a crisis, and questions around, is the crisis the fall of Bolivarian revolution or socialism? as the event sort of claims, is Venezuela the failure of socialism? I think instead of answering these questions, I think that these questions lead to a particular blueprint of a crisis that, although often correct, it leads into statements like, Venezuela is the new Cuba. We can't negotiate with Chavismo. There will be an eventual civil war, or de esta salimos cuando nos matemos toditos. We need to be careful of how we construct the Venezuelan crisis and deconstruct narratives that have neither helped the Venezuelan people, my people, nor resolved this crisis. So just as a plug, I think that the crisis, I'm not advocating that the crisis doesn't exist, I'm just providing a new angle, possibly, where we can look at, of how we can look at the crisis. So the biggest one is this whole debate and talk about the U.S. economic sanctions. The threat of invasion, according to the new, which probably the panel will talk about, the new Houseman article, and Venezuela in the international debate. Experts over and over have stated that, and this is all I'm going to say about the sanctions, is that economic sanctions, unilateral economic sanctions, have never worked, not one case, in oil exporting countries. Maybe the European Union sanctions might move into a multilateral approach, but there is a whole narrative of the threat of economic sanctions and whether this might lead to a U.S. invasion that only fortifies sort of internal rhetoric and propaganda, and that is Chavez's wildest dreams, and that's a Piti Yankee invasion. And so we need to be careful on how we sort of reflect on this moment in time. And I think another valid point is to maybe talk about sort of the economic benefits that are happening around economic sanctions and what I want to call petrodiplomacy part 2. So petrodiplomacy revolving around CARICOM nations where Venezuela used to, through oil exchanges, right, control sort of the OAS debates. And now it's, China and Russia sort of controlling and giving a lifeline to Venezuela. And so I think to dig deeper into what does that mean for Venezuela, and I'll conclude with this, is most of the debates around Venezuela often exclude Venezuela. So Venezuela leaving the OAS, the whole DC talks about sanctions that never include Venezuelan officials. They are often invited and often deny sort of the invitation to talk in a think tank in DC. But my experience working for the Inter-American Dialogue is that most times, right, it's a one-way talk. So what would it look like, right, to include and to really discuss beyond the current negotiations in the Dominican Republic, but to really bring these actors to the table. And so here is kind of where my research comes into play and sort of my suggestion for a new lens of how to look at the crisis. I think the obvious is that the Venezuelan economy has collapsed despite the hyperinflation, the political repression, and what some have categorized as a humanitarian crisis. There are many Venezuelans working on homegrown solutions. I've had the pleasure of working with organizations like Caracas Mi Convive and their programs Alimentando la Solidaridad, which are basically sort of community-led programs that provide food for the poorest neighborhoods in Caracas, like Petare, El Junquito. And so these are youth, just like myself, who are working beyond this idea of la salida, because they believe that regardless of who's in power, these solutions need all of us. And they need to include more than just government or politicians, but they need to include, community programs. Ironically, most of these programs are modeled after what we have seen in the past, and those are misiones, call it populism's best creation. But these were some of the programs that won the hearts of many Chavistas under his time. So, because I have 5 minutes. The images of long lines of empty supermarkets and dilapidated hospitals plague international outlets. But reality, if you ask anyone who lives or is from Venezuela, is much, much worse. The media, and hence the dominant narratives, report that shortages took over Caracas under Maduro at the beginning of 2014. My research argues that the crisis took over the country, the places Caraqueños call Monte Culebra, long before 2014 and well into the reign of Chavez. The collapse of the Bolivarian economy occurred during Chavez's reign, and so did other trends. One of the highest maternal mortality rates in the region, HIV deaths, and the epidemic of preventable diseases. The victims of this crisis, the poor, women, and people of color. And this is where my research kind of touches on, is that most of the victims of the crisis are women, and that's not necessarily the dominant narrative of this crisis in Venezuela. So a recent report, Mujeres al Límite, el de la emergencia humanitaria vulneración de derechos humanos de las mujeres en Venezuela, by leading women NGOs, showed that the burden on women to obtain food has increased over the years. Women make up 90% of the Clap Emercal purchases, which are time-consuming and often fruitless. The most current numbers reported by the Federación Farmacéutica de Venezuela says that there is currently 90% scarcity in contraceptives affecting women's reproductive health, but also the entire population's sexual health. Venezuela holds one of the highest maternal mortality rates and adolescent pregnancy rates in the region. 13% in maternal mortality rate increased from 13% in 2014 to 65.8% in a period of over 2 years. We rank probably the highest, this was numbers from 2012, but adolescent pregnancy rate of 101 per 1,000 people. And another thing that is currently emerging on research on Venezuela is the recent arbitrary detentions of protesters have also included cases of sexual violence against women prisoners. The violence against women in detention by the state was also seen at the peak of Hugo Chavez's government, with the most well-known case of the jueza Maria Lourdes Afuini, if anyone knows of that case. And so I think these are important considerations that maybe make us question if really the solution to these problems is a political exit, la salida of one person in government. I'll put that for reflection. So decentralizing the narrative of the crisis from Caracas is essential, but probably the hardest piece in this puzzle. And make no mistake, the anatomy of this crisis is gendered, it's racialized, it's more than just the WhatsApp complaints from El Este de Caracas. And if I can end with the following, during my time in DC, I had the privilege of listening to various experts on Venezuela, and this is my one key takeaway from Luis Vicente León from Data Analysis, who said, when we look at how we're gonna get out of this crisis, we need to start talking about negotiation. Dialogue has a bad rep in Venezuela. Negotiation might be the better way. And one of the most important things that we need to hopefully understand is that usually negotiations don't happen with our best friends. We negotiate with whom we have to negotiate, and that might include our enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for this vision of Venezuela. Now we hear somebody from the global north, Kirk Hawkins, who holds a PhD from Duke, is a professor at Brigham Young University, and has done a lot of very fascinating work on Venezuela and also on populism. Has, in some sense, come up with a new way of measuring a discourse, an ideational approach to populism, published an excellent book in 2010 from Cambridge University Press about the topic. And so, Kirk, please give us your
All right.
assessment of the situation.
Should I use the authoritative podium?
I think since you speak about charismatic leadership, populism, right?
Although, I hope Kurt isn't disappointed. I'm not going to say anything about populism today. I only got into populism because of my studies of Venezuela. So as a PhD student, I was in Venezuela studying the Chavez government and studying originally the old parties. I spent 4 months interviewing the old party leaders in 1999, and at the end decided it was kind of a boring waste of my time. And so I started studying this new thing happening, the Chavez government, and had a chance very early to meet with and talk with many members of the government. And that gave me a very different perspective and a whole different research trajectory that Kurt has mentioned. Today, I want to talk a little bit as a political scientist. And so perhaps not following the counsel that Andrea has just given us to not focus too much on the salida política, I kind of want to talk about that. And I want to talk about it as a political scientist and bring a little bit of a perspective to it that I think has maybe been missing in a lot of this debate. So I'm going to make more or less 2 points. One is that, in case you hadn't noticed, Venezuela is no longer a democracy. It is an autocratic regime. And so I think that there needs to be a great shift in the way we think about and approach things like a question of a salida, and start thinking in terms of democratic transitions and the conditions under which those happen, the ways that they take place, and what that would mean for us. And so then, to do that, I'm going to make a few suggestions of some sort of obvious, old-school things that transitologists would have said about Venezuela if this were a case that were being studied back in the late 1980s, when a lot of that literature was first done by political scientists, when they were studying the beginning of the third wave of democracy. Now, I hope that this will be a little bit of an antidote for some Venezuelanists or Venezuelans among us, because since the country in the late 1980s was still in the midst of its, what we thought was a thriving democracy, many of the scholars and people studying it just sort of wrote off a lot of that literature. They didn't study it very intensely. It didn't seem to apply a lot to the Venezuelan case because their transition happened in 1958, so long ago. So maybe it's time now for Venezuelan scholars and some policymakers to rejoin that discussion and to pick up some of that old literature. So when I say it's no longer a democracy, this is an important thing. Now, you could look at some statistics. I could show you the Freedom House indicators and show you quantitatively how we make this judgment and say, just this year, Freedom House says political rights in Venezuela are a 6. For those of you who know what that scale means, you should say, they've crossed the line. I mean, they have, so numerically they've crossed this line. But that quantitative point isn't really what I want to make. The bigger point is that when we talk about a regime that's autocratic, what we're really saying is not that they didn't satisfy Freedom House's standards, but that there's a qualitative difference in how that regime works, how that government stays in power. In a democracy, the regime, that government is thinking, as other opposing parties would be, about the next election. They're thinking about how can I compete with these other parties running against me. Maybe they're in Congress, they're in other parts of the government. And the game for me is always to be thinking about the next election and how am I going to look compared to them. So you're playing a competitive game. There's some rules to that game that you follow that we're familiar with. But internally, you've organized to do that. So you're thinking constantly about the next campaign. You're thinking about working with other legislators from the other side, how that's going to look. There's a whole mentality to this, the whole way of organizing as parties. And that is no longer true of Chavismo. It is not organized as a democratic party at all. And so instead we have to start thinking about it in other terms. What is it? Well, it's a governing coalition. So again, I'm already drawing there on some terms from the transitology literature of the 1980s. And they would talk about the regime coalition that existed. And what kind of an organization is this thing? It's geared towards staying in power through the use of force. That's what it's thinking about. It's not thinking about the next election, except as a way of maybe winning fraudulently if needs be, using every means at its disposal to make sure that the opposition is not going to win that thing. So this is no longer a democratic game, and I think we need to move beyond that. That has some implications for a lot of things. One is thinking about this is tricky. I want to be careful when I say, to be careful how you think then about negotiations. Because you have to say, what kind of a government, what kind of a ruling coalition regime is this? Are they open to negotiations? So let me talk here, one insight from the transitology literature. And this is going to be the notion that we can talk about different kinds of transitions. And this is, again, this is very old, very basic, but we would talk about there's the pacted transition and there's a rupture transition. And these come actually from the Spanish, where some of the scholars studying this originally talked about ruptura and pactado. And the thing is, a lot of the conversation about Venezuela over the past year or two, as they talk about the challenge, has actually been approaching this as if it were going to be a pacted transition. I don't know why we've been thinking about it that way. Maybe because it's more pleasant to think about that and more hopeful. Pacted transitions do have, what are they? They're going to be a little slower, and as the name suggests, the democratic opposition has some ability to hive off part of that governing coalition that wants a little bit of democracy, that's starting to break with the hardliners, and they're going to negotiate a solution out of that. That's what they do. We have examples of pacted transitions in a number of countries. Chile, for example, is a good example of this in the late 1980s. That is probably not what's going to happen with Chavismo. I don't think it will. And why is that? Because pacted transitions happen because a segment of the ruling coalition wants democracy. If we look at the ruling coalition right now, the PSUV and the military allies, neither of them, at this point, as far as I know, there aren't a lot of pro-democratic elements of that ruling coalition. Most of the moderates within Chavismo have been sidelined, shoved out of the movement. These are the ones riding on Aporrea, the ones who, they're socialists, but they also believe wholeheartedly in democracy. And they've been shoved out of the way. And they're now on the sidelines saying, hey, this government's become very corrupt, and hey, wait, it's not listening to me anymore. And what's going on? Well, that's because what's left are some real hardliners who, again, I'm going to sound bad here, Cuba is the model for them. And so they don't really see the need for liberal democracy in the sense that we know it. The military, on the other hand, is in this, some of them are in for ideological reasons, but they're also in it because they're earning a lot of money through corrupt means right now. So they're involved in the black market. They're also involved in the drug trade. And they have a lot of control over legitimate government programs too, which they then use to make a lot more money. And so many within the military, if they're not there for ideological reasons, they're there for money. And they're very well aware that if there were a transition to democracy, they would probably go to jail. They have no incentive to stop this thing and to return to a democracy. A democracy for them would be very dangerous. So what I see right now is a difficult situation in which a pacted transition seems to me at this moment very unlikely. Wow, okay, well what does that mean? That's when we talk about a rupture, the ruptura. What do these look like? Well, they're usually not quite so gradual. And here's the thing though, they require outside events that usually shake or destroy the ability of the regime to maintain itself. It hauls it out from within and it's no longer able to stand. Ironically, one of the good examples of a rupture would be 1958 in Venezuela. We think of this as a pacted experience, but it wasn't. The pact was among the opposition. It wasn't with members of the regime by and large. Members of the regime left. Pérez Jiménez leaves the country. There's no negotiation that happens there. It's done. So after a series of demonstrations, they break with this, and the group that has pacted together the opposition then says, okay, I guess we get to run the country now with these elements of the military that have stayed behind and are going to let us do this. So what could happen? This is where a lot of the talk comes about economic collapse. Let me point out two reasons, though, that give us pause, and here I want to side a bit with Andrea. So one is that the economy may eventually get them there, right? This is undermining the regime, but you need to realize that we actually have the Russians and the Chinese giving significant loans, so they're propping up the regime. That means it may be a while before that economy hollows out that regime and leads to this rupture that the transitologists would have talked about. The second is the oil embargo. Now, by the way, I'm opposed, I'm very concerned about an oil embargo, but not for the reasons that Andrea has given. I don't think that if there's any place in the world where an embargo would work, it would be in a country that's highly dependent on one purchaser of its oil, which happens to be the United States, and where the government lives off that one product. Wow, if an embargo would work anywhere, it might be here, but why not? Well, there's another more practical reason. which is that, again, don't forget the Russians and the Chinese are propping this up. So the government wouldn't just stand by while the U.S. Embargoed their oil like that. They would be looking for resources outside. And so it would be a question of who could last longest there. The second thing to think about is that the military, which is an important component of the current ruling coalition, does not just subsist on oil revenue. They also subsist on contraband trade and the drug trade. And they're making a lot of money there. And so that may allow them to continue on for much longer than the rest of the population. So the oil embargo maybe won't, but I think for different reasons. My time's up and I'll end with that.
Great, thank you very much. The next speaker is Professor Thais Maingon from Venezuela. She just escaped from the country about a month ago and joined us here as a Fulbright visiting scholar. She is a professor at the Universidad Central de Venezuela in the Centro de Desarrollo and has written a number of important books on public policy, social policy in Venezuela.
Voy a hablar en español. Primero, quiero dar las gracias a Paloma y a Kirk por apoyarme y por invitarme a este foro. Segundo, quisiera recordar que hoy es 23 de enero y hace 45 años, ¿no? Se considera como el inicio de la democracia en Venezuela, el proceso de democratización con los pactos, que fueron pactos negociados, por cierto, con los sectores más importantes, con más poder en el país, los empresarios, los militares y la iglesia, posteriormente. Se pudo construir un piso que luego fue tomado por los pactos de la Moncloa, por ejemplo, en España, que fue otro país que tuvo que negociar después de la muerte de Franco, para restaurar la democracia. Eso solamente como un recuerdo. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con Kirk. En Venezuela ya no tiene un sistema político que se le pueda decir que es un sistema híbrido. No es un autoritarismo competitivo, no es un autoritarismo electoral, es una autocracia o una dictadura, algunos le dicen moderna. Actualmente en Venezuela se inhabilita a los opositores, se les persigue, se les encarcela, se reprime cualquier tipo de protesta, así sean por reclamos, por restauración de servicios como el agua, la luz, el gas, y desde hace 2 años y medio por alimentación. No hay comida, o por reclamos de las famosas bolsas CLAP, que son los comités, creo que todos ustedes han oído hablar de estas bolsas, con el agravante de que se tiene que sacar un carnet llamado carnet de la patria, existe, es verdadero, donde si tú no lo tienes no accedes a es el clientelismo forzado y de forma excluyente, excluye a una parte de la sociedad, incluye a otra, pero es un clientelismo forzado. Hay una represión focalizada a través de lo que se llama la OLP, los organismos de liberación del pueblo que se llaman, que van y tienen el camino libre para poder matar con licencia, digámoslo así, a los sectores populares mayoritariamente, a las bandas. Todos son acusados de bandas. Yo no digo que no hay bandas de malandros y de ladrones, que también las hay dentro del régimen, pero no tienen OLP que vaya a perseguirlo. Hay una crisis humanitaria fuerte de alimentos y medicamentos, medicina. No tenemos medicina. No hay autonomía de los poderes, no hay libertad de expresión. Como señaló Andrea, la mortalidad infantil, todos los indicadores significativos de salud y sociales la mortalidad infantil ha subido, la mortalidad materna también, a las enfermedades reemergentes, desaparecidas como la difteria. Nuestros médicos graduados, recién graduados, no saben lo que es la difteria, porque hace más de 30 años la difteria está desaparecida del país, pero volvió. No voy a hablar de la inflación, de la hiperinflación, que más allá de lo que significa también una desinstitucionalización, generalizada en el gobierno. No hay instituciones, no hay políticas públicas. Eso es más conocido. Ahora, yo quisiera enfocarme en un punto que tiene que ver con la democracia, que es la apropiación que ha hecho el régimen desde un principio del concepto y de la concepción de la democracia. Porque hasta hoy en día uno escucha a cualquier vocero del régimen y hablan sobre la democracia del pueblo, para el pueblo y por el pueblo. Yo creo, no lo he trabajado, solamente ideas, que hay una apropiación contradictoria del régimen del concepto de la democracia. Desde el poder se restringen los espacios públicos, todos, religiosos, se persiguen a los religiosos, se persiguen a los movimientos sociales y a las organizaciones civiles que sean diferentes al régimen, que no sean establecidas y organizadas por el régimen. No se pueden, en Venezuela hoy es imposible articular autónomamente demandas y derechos, demandas por derechos, es imposible articularlas. Cuando se comienza a hacer una articulación, inmediatamente el concepto de democracia contradictorio, que supongo que digo que tiene el régimen actualmente, no promueve una libertad de organización, sino que más bien cierra esos espacios de diferentes formas, que llegan inclusive hasta la muerte, hasta la desaparición física de las personas. Llegando entonces a, uno podría decir que la democracia entonces para el régimen es una democracia plebiscitaria. O sea, yo hago elecciones cuando las voy a ganar. Hoy en la mañana, la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, ilegal e ilegítima, está haciendo una solicitud al Consejo Nacional Electoral, que es el órgano que administra las elecciones en Venezuela, para que las elecciones presidenciales sean en el primer semestre de este año. El petróleo está a más de $60 por barril. Cuando estaba hace un mes en 40, no llegaba a 40. Esa es la otra apropiación del concepto de la democracia que tiene el régimen. Hay democracia mientras yo tenga dinero del petróleo para poder pagar, para poder solucionar, para poder importar comida, o cuando no tengo, se cierran todos los espacios. Eso, bueno. También quisiera, yo no sé si estos blurb los reciben ustedes. Bueno, perdón, yo pensé que los recibían y por eso hablé, complementé lo que había escrito aquí. También quisiera hablar sobre había un punto que Paloma levantó sobre las sanciones a nivel internacional, que si esto era importante o no. Yo pienso que, por un lado, Estados Unidos no puede liderar ninguna sanción con Venezuela porque no van a ser aceptadas por el resto de la comunidad internacional, europea y latinoamericana, hoy en día. Se puede discutir por qué razón. Segundo, al régimen no le preocupa para nada la restauración de la democracia en Venezuela. Por lo tanto, las sanciones y críticas que la comunidad internacional haga a este régimen, lo que hace es endurecer la política interna hacia la oposición, hacia las organizaciones civiles y hacia cualquier tipo de defensores de derechos humanos. Eso por un lado. Por el otro lado, sí, las negociaciones o las sanciones internacionales ayudan a que se conozca en el mundo entero lo que está haciendo la nomenclatura venezolana en el poder con los ciudadanos. Porque muchos países que apoyaban al régimen ahora ya no lo apoyan, o por lo menos no dicen que lo apoyan. Sí, me parece que es necesario adoptar medidas significativas que hagan para hacer frente al régimen madurista. La región ha dejado claro que no quiere que Estados Unidos lidere estas estrategias contra la crisis venezolana, y creo que es probable que se extiendan las sanciones a Venezuela. Y luego con la negociación, sí, ciertamente no es diálogo, es negociación, pero la negociación no tiene que estar dentro del marco de la Constitución del 99, es lo mínimo que se puede pedir en un proceso de negociación en Venezuela.
Thank you very much. So after all these speakers gave you a lot of food for thought, I have a very easy task of just drawing a few conclusions at the end. So to go back to the initial questions raised, are Venezuela's problems, are they the result of accidental factors? For example, the death of Chavez, the fact that Maduro took over, doesn't nearly have the charisma of Chavez. Are they the result, for example, of the tremendous drop in international oil prices, or do Venezuela's problems really go back and have their root in the inherent flaws in the model of Bolivarian socialism? I personally think that the problems clearly did not start with Maduro. I think they're not due to the fact that a comparatively uncharismatic, not politically all that savvy successor has taken over. I also don't think that the problems are really rooted in the reduction in the international oil price. In my view, the economic and political problems have their roots in Chavez's model as such, this Bolivarian populist socialism. And you see that from very early on the political front. Chavez, maybe one of the first things he did, start concentrating power in the 99 constitution with the decrees of late 2001, then in some sense taking advantage of the coup attempt of 2002, taking advantage of the lockout and strike of 2002, 2003, the kind of one of the sort of persistent trend lines was concentrating power, using this plebiscitarian populist approach to essentially get rid of institutional constraints, subdue, divide the opposition. And so in my assessment, already under Chavez, from 2006, 2007 onward, Venezuela can't count as a democracy anymore. It's slid into a competitive authoritarian regime that now Maduro has in some sense more openly shown the autocratic, more repressive side of it, but it wasn't a democracy already under Chavez. Similar with the economic model, and I think problems started already with the currency controls of 2003, then especially from 2006 after the re-election onward, the just tremendous pursuit of nationalization and expropriation that obviously scared domestic and international business and I think underlies these scarcities, price controls, all these things. So, what is interesting there, I think the problem in many ways came more from the populist than the so-called socialist side, although nobody ever knows what Bolivarian socialism exactly meant, but kind of that haphazard, arbitrary implementations. Chavez cruising around on Allo Presidente said, oh, look at this business, let's nationalize it, right? I mean, socialism supposedly is planned and rational, and it was just very arbitrary and haphazard and populist, and that creates so much uncertainty for businesses, scares away investment, that I think that is among the root causes of the current crisis. We're also talking about that international commodities boom that Venezuela took advantage of, that in many ways, I think, for many years covered up the inherent flaws of the Bolivarian economic model, allowed them to go on with very distortionary economic policies. So the commodities boom, in some sense, allowed this model to go on much longer. I mean, economists for years had said, this is not sustainable, not sustainable. Chavez said, oh, we are sustaining it quite well. As soon as the oil price went down, not even to very low levels, when you look at it in terms of timeline, I mean, $60 per barrel is not unusually low. When you look at the long-term trend, as soon as the oil price went down from its unusually stratospheric levels, these structural flaws became very obvious. And so, I mean, in my personal view, to be a little provocative, I think that the model of Bolivarian socialism is just inherently flawed and unviable, and politically and economically. So then the question is, how do you emerge from that? How do you get out of it? There, I think in some sense, the US economic sanctions do have some bite. I mean, what Trump did excluded Venezuela from international capital and debt markets, and you can read, for example, that in El País, the Venezuelan oil industry is just being essentially strangulated, partly due to those sanctions. It hasn't happened. What, in many ways, I think, has backfired are essentially kind of the threat of prosecution, those sanctions that Venezuelan officials can't get into the United States anymore and would be subject to prosecution if they came here. And in many ways, what you see there is, of course, what we celebrate in some sense, right? The international community tries to maintain and enforce norms of human rights, of proper behavior, of non-involvement in drug trafficking, and all these kinds of things. So in many ways, we celebrate the legalization of international politics, right? Pinochet was hauled in. A number of dictators have been hauled in as a result of this legalization of international affairs. It's a good thing in many ways. But, of course, in the short term, it can have unintended consequences because when Pinochet is out of power, you can put him under house arrest. But when Maduro is in power, what these sanctions do is tell him, ooh, I do not want to lose power by any means, because if I lose power, I might go the way of Manuel Noriega and spend 20, 30 years in the US federal prison, and then the French get me, and then the Brits, and that's it. And so what you see is, I think these sanctions, in some sense, have strengthened the determination of the current power elite, politicians and military types, to cling to power as much as they can. And so they backfire in the sense of kind of blocking a potential solution. So when Kirk and Tice don't think that negotiations will go very far, I think one reason is that this current elite doesn't want to give up power by any means because of that fear and that threat. And so that's the reason why, we all would hope that negotiations would work. I don't think they'll actually go very far in the case. I mean, they've essentially been negotiating for years, and whenever it doesn't please them, they stop negotiation and they don't make concessions, and it's essentially kind of a game to divide the opposition. That's how I see the negotiations. So then the question is, how do you get out of it? Elections? I mean, essentially what you see is the opposition cannot win elections in Venezuela because there's way too much manipulation, intimidation, way too exclusive control of all the electoral authorities. And even if the opposition wins, like they did a couple of times under Chavez, all you do is you just disempower the offices that the opposition wins. Like the mayoralty of Caracas in 2008 or the National Assembly, and you create parallel institutions, and so the opposition wins, but wins nothing. They win essentially an empty claim to nothing. So like the announcement of elections, I think, is another kind of trick in that respect. So then what do you do? Right? So here comes Ricardo Hausmann, maybe we should have an international military intervention. It doesn't have to be the gringos just on their own, but let's get the Brazilians and the Chileans and the Argentines on board. Oh yeah, right, I mean, that's not going to happen. So in some sense, ironically, maybe the only way out is doing what Chavez originally tried to do, essentially kind of uprising of junior officers who are not totally corrupted and not totally involved in drug trafficking and contraband, like the senior leadership, and let's say, let's get this poll tax out. And somehow or other, I mean, that might be the only way. And I'm not usually the person who is into military coups. But there's actually no research in political science, or can hide behind political science, that shows when military coups happen in an autocratic regime, in an authoritarian regime, not in a democracy like against Allende or in a democracy like in Brazil in 1964, but when a coup happens in military regime, no research suggesting that that can have a democratizing impact, because it's the only way to kind of upset and unsettle an established autocratic regime when a coup happens, especially nowadays, when the international community more or less is committed to democracy. When you're a coup maker, you don't say, oh, now we're going to stay in power for the next 30 years. You say, oh, I just got rid of the current regime. I'm opening up for elections. And so, for the first time in my life, I'm saying maybe the only way out is some kind of military coup, and I'm saying it cautiously and carefully, and don't want to be pelted with tomatoes and eggs. But I mean, given that there doesn't seem to be any other real way out, at least something to discuss at an urgent forum where, as I said before, we don't have to be as self-disciplined in our neutrality as scholars, but can kind of cut loose a little bit. So that as maybe a really provocative additional stimulus for the discussion that we want to open up right now. And given that this room is so long here, I think I'll have to stand here to make sure that all of you are sitting behind the podium don't get excluded. So if you want to ask questions, make comments, voice your own opinions, right, we're opening up for the discussion.
We're doing it live on Facebook, and there's somebody asking, Eric Vega is asking, ¿qué opina de la desdolarización de las transacciones del petróleo del venezolano?
O sea, el petro.
Mira,
no sé, la verdad es que no sé. Pero esa moneda, la desdolarización tiene que ver con la cripto, ¿cómo se llama?
Criptomoneda.
Criptomoneda no, petro.
Algo
petrocripto, no sé. Pero tiene que ver con Superman, no lo sé, no sé. Esa pregunta no sé.
Hello.
I have the selfish question here, is how much damage the Venezuelan crisis can do for the case of the left and the rest of Latin America, just thinking of the Chilean elections in which the right used, according to me, effectively, these goals of the left to scare electorate because the Chilezuela, and I'm afraid the rest of the other countries may start using that case to dominate. Do you think it will have that kind of impact in other countries?
Are you asking
Any
Yes.
Yes.
I think it does. I mean, we hear echoes of that other places. In Spain, for example, they'll refer to Podemos and say, you're just Chavez, and we don't want that. I think, though, the question is if the Venezuelan government cares about that, and they don't. I don't think they care if they're making life a little more difficult for some of their compatriots in other countries. I think partly because the ones who are most hurt by this are the moderate left parties. And I think Chavismo sees those moderate leftists as traitors to the cause. And so I think it's probably happy that it's harming them. Doesn't mind that at all.
I think you can also see in the case of Mexico with López Obrador, the narrative around, this is the next Chavez, sharing sort of the charismatic leader approach. But I think also besides the narrative of a next Chavez or the new Cuba is also some legitimate concerns of neighboring countries, of the spillover of refugees. In the case of Colombia, in the case of Brazil, in the case of also spillover, if not already, of organized crime. And so thinking about, the legitimate concerns that some of these countries have, but then that being reverted into a narrative of xenophobia against Venezuelans in many countries, that might be used, I would say, I'm not a political scientist, just a noble anthropologist wannabe, that might have some effect in right-wing parties as well, especially this sort of new mix of populist meets, right-wing parties.
Sí, Venezuela.
Sure.
Sí, esa pregunta es muy importante porque es lo que está expresando Venezuela en la región y fuera de la región también, en Europa. Venezuela se caracterizó por ser un país que siempre recibió a inmigrantes de cualquier parte, de la Guerra Civil Española, españoles, italianos, portugueses. Cuando el sur de América Latina, Suramérica, tenía las dictaduras en Uruguay, Brasil, Chile y Argentina, nosotros recibimos a todas estas nacionalidades en nuestro país, daban clase en la universidad. Lo mismo fue con Colombia, que es nuestro país hermano. Eso está trayendo la inmigración venezolana, que en un principio fue muy profesional, de profesionales que se iban, ahora todo el mundo se está yendo. De hasta las bandas organizadas. Están yendo a montar bandas organizadas en otros países, como por ejemplo Colombia. Eso está trayendo un problema de xenofobia muy, muy grave. eso por un lado, la parte social o sociopolítica. Ahora, en lo que tiene que ver con los partidos, es correcto. Yo tengo algo que digo, que es que el mundo se chavizó. Mi hijo estudia en Toronto, Canadá, y la universidad donde está estudiando, los profesores hicieron una huelga, que es casi nunca se huelga los profesores de la Universidad de Canadá, por mejores salarios, qué sé yo. Entonces, si ustedes observan, o si ustedes van hacia atrás y observan cómo hablaba Chávez y lo que decía, y ven cómo habla Trump, no hay mucha diferencia. Muy peligroso lo que está pasando. No digo que digan mentiras o que todo lo que dijeron fueran mentiras, bueno, no estoy hablando de eso, sino el estilo de banalizar la política, de banalizar la profesión de los políticos. Los políticos son profesionales y deben tener un sueldo, un salario que puedan vivir de ello, que impida que sean corruptos, que tengan que hacer corrupción para poder vivir. Y esto está, el giro a la derecha que se está hablando ahora en en Sudamérica, Macri en Argentina, Piñera en Chile, Temer en los juicios a Lula, también puede ser una reacción en contra de lo que podría estos países, el miedo de las sociedades a llegar a ser como una Venezuela. Esto también es muy peligroso porque en Venezuela yo soy de las que creo y lo defiendo que no hubo ningún socialismo, ningún giro a la izquierda. Las izquierdas tienen que tener apellido. O sea, es izquierda autoritaria o izquierda socialista o izquierda democrática, pero socialismo del siglo XXI o izquierda bolivariana, que alguien me lo explique. Entonces, las izquierdas son importantes, tienen que tener un apellido, no pueden ser, tienen que tener una base ideológica, una definición, algo de donde uno estudiar. Y yo sí creo que esto está en la parte, en todo lo que tiene que ver con los sistemas políticos latinoamericanos, está teniendo una influencia muy negativa, y lo que tiene que ver con la sociopolítica, lo social, también hay una influencia muy negativa. Hoy también acaba de decir alguien en Panamá, no recuerdo el título, no quieren a los venezolanos profesionales, solamente turistas. Ya están restringiendo la llegada de los venezolanos a los otros países.
Yes, I wanted to touch upon again the political opposition, and I know they've been recently criticized for not having been effectively able to mobilize a lot of support and for a lot of ruptures within the opposition itself. And one point that I was curious on your take is whether it is worth participating in some of these parallel institutions and whether that gives them legitimacy and whether those fraudulent results will then be interpreted as more legitimate, or if they should be abstaining from participating in those institutions, because that was a big point of contention amongst opposition parties. And then aside from that, what are some other avenues for participation and some other strategies for the political opposition, and which could potentially slow down the consolidation of power and perhaps reverse it, and what are some other strategies we can talk about, perhaps aside from potential mid-level insurrection of army officials? So.
I've seen plenty of panels that of scholars that sit around beating up on the opposition because they won't negotiate, because they won't participate in the elections, and I don't know. I think we missed the point. If that were the conversation in 2002 and 2003, that was the correct conversation. But the situation has changed. I have no realistic expectation that the presidential election will be a fair one or the opposition will be allowed to win that. In fact, I presume that opposition that participates in the election, that they're opening themselves up that way, that they'll be further repressed, and that people who participate as candidates, that they face real danger there. So given that, I think, why should they participate? That's not a good calculation. And so for me, it's a very difficult situation right now because the opposition has to find a space in which it can exist as an organization and continue to plan and think for the future, but knowing that right now, participation in any election that I can conceive of right now is pointless. But again, we need to say this was what Chile was like in 1982 or 83 or 84, and it was very hard. It was very hard. You looked for whatever space you could. You looked for people living abroad and funding, and you worked with your exile community, and you did what you could. But it was all they could do. I think they're in that situation now. I'm very pessimistic about this right now, and I think they have to scramble and do what they can. That's what we call muddling through. And that's a very hard situation to be in. I no longer beat up the opposition for not participating in these in elections. I don't know what point it would serve. I really don't. I think it's a waste of their time and money. And and right now they're having to spend a lot of time just trying to keep the family alive. So.
I agree. I think the opposition effectively has no option. The protest didn't work, partly because the Chavistas have this local level, kind of thugs that essentially beat up enough people that sort of a mass protest can't really work and can't really shake the regime from the bottom up. I think all the electoral institutional avenues are so manipulated and so closed and so subject to all kinds of informal and formal pressures. I mean, in some sense, they have really no realistic option for advancing anything. So I think the only option is essentially to say, I withdraw, I just boycott. I mean, I honestly don't think that these negotiations that have been going on for such a long time will have international mediation. The international mediators in my view have made no real positive impact. I think the only thing to do at this point is to say we don't legitimate this pseudo system by running candidates and whatever.
I think I would disagree. I think that's the easy way out. And I think that also erases a lot of the coalition that has been kind of the blueprint of the opposition for many years. So again, decentralizing the political strategy from Caracas would take a look at local politics and also local movements from the inner cities or the interior of the country, and the work that they're doing. So alcaldes of Maturin, like where I'm from, that still struggle, that might get their budgets slashed, but that are still trying to sort of practice that professionalism of politics. That might be the only sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And I think, even though I critique the Harvard Kennedy boys that are all from like one little school in Caracas and then come to Harvard and then they are educated under Haussmann and they go back to Venezuela and they write this wonderful post where they're going to save Venezuela, even though I have my criticism of them, I think that that's a very valid and honorable work that they're doing in Venezuela. There's Roberto Patiño with Alimentando la Solidaridad, Caracas Me Convive. There are some who have been having, after working many years in Venezuela under NGOs, they've had to escape the country out of political persecution. But that does, and I think that's maybe the need to examine everyday life in Venezuela. Those actions and those struggles, even if it ends in the political persecution of one of those jóvenes, it does breathe life to people that might not have the option of leaving Venezuela. And so I think maybe the better question is, how can the opposition reconfigure itself to not only look at a political strategy, but building movement? I don't think it's designed that way. I think they do a terrible job at calling only a protest in el este de Caracas again. I like el este de Caracas. I visit there often. I have coffee with a friend there. But that's not Venezuela. And I think also there's a coalition of indigenous leaders and Afro-descendant leaders that are of former Aporrea writers that are disenchanted with the government, that also believe that socialism never really happened in Venezuela, and that's an opportunity for an even bigger coalition. I don't know how that might look like, but what would that look like, you know? And I don't think that's being talked at all within the opposition, especially led by men and, you know, all the other stuff.
¿Entiendes? Esa es una preocupación que por lo menos en mi cabeza está todos los días de mi vida. ¿Cómo hacer, cómo los partidos políticos se reorganizan, se reinstitucionalizan para poder encontrar una opción que nos dé de comer en un principio, nos dé medicinas, nos dé nuestros bienes básicos? Sí es cierto, hay muchos movimientos y muchas organizaciones. Algunas se llaman la olla solidaria. Es una olla de este tamaño que hacen sopa para que coma la gente, pero eso no es una solución, Andrea. Ni en que en los 24 estados del país se hagan ollas para comer, eso no es ninguna solución. Porque cada vez la clase media está desapareciendo. ¿Y quién da el pollo para hacer la olla solidaria? La clase media, yo. Ese es un problema. Básicamente, el core, el centro del problema es que la oposición está compuesta por muchísimos grupos que son heterogéneos entre sí y que hay extremos que se encuentran. Por ejemplo, no sé, Corina Machado, no sé si Venezuela, no sé cómo es, se encuentran. Entonces, cómo se expresan dentro de la oposición, hay expresión, hablan, dicen lo que piensan, no es lo mismo que pasa en el PSV, que nadie habla, solo uno. Entonces yo creo que Venezuela, yo no sé si estará de acuerdo, los partidos políticos en Venezuela, los partidos políticos tradicionales, eran partidos políticos organizados como partidos leninistas, muy autoritarios, eran partidos autoritarios. Cuando vienen los jóvenes, inclusive los que se fueron y los que vinieron, Leopoldo López, Capriles, vienen con otra visión a formar nuevos partidos políticos, donde todo el mundo habla. Esto choca con, por lo menos, Acción Democrática, porque COPEI casi que no existe, que es el partido. Choca con esta manera de hacer las cosas y no nos hemos adaptado. No ha habido una adaptación a la manera de hacer una nueva política entre los viejos. Estamos en el antiguo régimen, como en la transición, nunca se hizo la transición de realmente democrática dentro de los partidos políticos. No sé si te logro transmitir lo que... Entonces, aquí estamos, esto es un nudo. Esto es un nudo realmente peligroso, que no hemos sabido, nuestros líderes, la oposición no ha sabido desenredar. Esta es una pregunta demasiado importante para este momento en Venezuela, que yo no tengo la respuesta. No lo sé. Lo veo muy mal, no soy optimista.
So this question is for Kirk, but anybody who wants to chime in. So I like the idea of studying this from the perspective of the literature on democratic transitions. And, you know, as you know, O'Donnell and Schmitter believe that all democratic transitions, all transitions from authoritarian regimes, begin with the splits within the authoritarian regime. So I guess my question is, if that's going to be the case here, on what lines is that split going to emerge? I mean, can you roll out some scenarios which would, you know, under which a split would occur that would actually bring out more possession?
Well, O'Donnell and Schmitter also said you could never predict this beforehand. Partly because the authoritarian coalition is very closed off. It doesn't let a lot of information out, and so we're not quite sure what the lines are, who's with who, and we still feel that there's a lot of guessing that happens about different groups. different factions within that. And so these would be wild guesses. So Kurt has given probably one of the most common scenarios we imagine, because it's taken place in Venezuela before, where younger cohorts in the military say, you know, I still have a conscience, my families and neighbors are being hurt by this, and I personally am not being enriched by it, so I rebel against this. And there's certainly historical precedent for that. Chavez wasn't the first moment where that took place. And so there's still, I think, a lot of sort of hope that might be one way that it happens. I used to think that because there was a significant democratic component of the PSUV, and Andrea's referenced them as well. And most of them have been sidelined right now, so I don't know that they're going to be split. They've already split, and they've been shoved aside. And so I don't. Yeah, I struggle to think of what else the split would be. It's really hard to see, and that's why I start to wonder about other things. I mean, maybe what happens when the government just runs out of money? You know. Yeah. So I don't know. Sorry, I don't have a better answer though.
So if I can add something, when you think of the O'Donnell and Schmider argument, the split was in many ways between softliners and hardliners, right? So there were some who thought that this type of authoritarian regime had potential persistence and some kind of inherent legitimacy, and the softliners so only wanted to kind of clean out the previous democracy, and then, you know, knew that nowadays, I mean, in the second half of the 20th century and thereafter, authoritarian rule doesn't have inherent legitimacy anymore. What I wonder is how that applies to a system like Bolivarian authoritarianism, where allegedly Chavez thought that his model was way better than established representative liberal democracy because it was participatory and protagonistic. So, you know, there's much more of a claim to kind of legitimacy in this. The second thing is that these Latin American military regimes were corrupt and had also committed human rights violations, but in terms of, I think, the level of kind of corruption and malfeasance in this, and I think also much stronger legalization of the international system, so kind of the risk these people would run in bringing about a democratic transition, I think is even higher than it was when these conservative military regimes were. So in some sense the glue, I mean, I see in many ways kind of a desperate need that this crowd sees, or this elite sees, for clinging to power because they really want that they would, you know, and especially because the legalization is international now. It's one thing, I'm Pinochet and I step down, but I still command the military, so who is going to touch me, right? But if I step down nowadays and get extradited to the US, that's it, 30 years. And so I wonder whether the O'Donnell-Schmider approach still applies to this kind of new type of authoritarianism. You had the question, and then Korte, and then...
Yeah, the question is for the panelists and whoever wants to answer this question. So, I personally believe that you have to say a lot of possible solutions like military troops and stuff like that. But let's see in the present and the future. So for example, today, as you said, they said there will be elections before April this year. And I agree the opposition shouldn't be there, first of all, because they don't have a real leader right now. So, for example, leaders like Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma, they are in prison or in exile. So there is no like a real leader right now, so it will be impossible to win. And it's really easy to manipulate votes. So it will be another 6 years of the Madurismo. And a possible military coup in Venezuela, it will be also for me possible because, for example, we saw 5 days ago they killed Oscar Perez and other military guys that were against the government. They were killed, they were massacred, and so let's throw that option out. Also, the military that are close to the government, they have a lot of money out, as you said, the drug issue and everything, so that will be another option that is not on the table. The negotiations in Dominican Republic, I saw today that the foreign ministers of Mexico and Chile, they are not going to go to the table anymore, and they were the two countries that were supporting the opposition. So I don't see any solution for or any way, or why would the opposition go to to Dominican Republic again if they are not going to have any support there. So that's another option that we have to roll out. So I believe also that in the international issue, the UN and the OAS and even the other countries like the United States and everyone, I don't believe, for example, that the United States will take a military option to Venezuela. I personally believe they are not that interested. Maybe I'm wrong, but they have another important issues like the Middle East and stuff like that, and even internal issues here. And other countries, probably South American countries, are not that powerful, or don't want to risk to get into military issue and then probably lose support in the international context. So all these things into the table that we have tried, that we will probably try and will never happen probably. What is an actual or real solution that we could have as Venezuelans? Because also the protests in Venezuela, more than 100 people killed. There is no reason the opposition are scared of calling for protests because they have the responsibility of the people going out. So what is a realistic solution that you could propose for this issue right now in the short term?
Whoever can answer the question will win the Nobel Prize for Peace.
I thought that was the point of the whole panel.
You want to take several to finish in time, several questions?
We have until 6, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So let's have some participatory debate. So, nobody has an answer. I mean, that's essentially right.
Bueno,
On
si el Papa Francisco no dijo nada sobre Venezuela, ¿qué podemos decir nosotros?
One thing is, Andrea's talking about this, but there is everyday life that has to be lived. And so these rather non-political actions to make do, to do the best you can, to create essentially soup kitchens. This also, if you look back at the literature on transitions, was a very common experience in other Latin American countries that were experiencing the debt crisis in the early 1980s. And so in Argentina and Chile and elsewhere, they would create these neighborhood groups. And in fact, there was also, now this is also tempering Andrea's enthusiasm, there was a great deal of scholarly excitement about these and a hope that this would be sort of a rebirth of Latin American society and democracy and everything. And what happened was that once the economic crisis passed, and as there was, in fact, a real chance for parties to participate in democratic politics, those movements and organizations often shrank and died because there was no need for them anymore. There was a shift towards traditional high politics, and people's everyday needs were being met through sort of ordinary means of a capitalist system. But they did that, and you had to, because it was the only way to stay alive. And so it's okay to do that. I mean, people need to stay alive. And so I commend the effort that's being made to do that. It's heroic, it's difficult, and it's saving lives in ways that I get very upset with the government right now because I think this isn't just a game of high politics. Tens of thousands of people are losing their lives as a result of this, from malnutrition, from preventable diseases, from infections that could have been easily treated, from mental illness, from suicide. All of this is happening, and all of this is on the government's shoulders. They have created this situation, and it angers me, and it cheers me to see those who do what they can in the face of a very difficult situation. That doesn't solve the political problem. That doesn't give you a magic solution there. And I should say, for most of us in here, that solution is utterly outside of our hands. So an oil embargo, I have no ability to create an oil embargo. None of you in here do. If that happens, it would be a decision by people elsewhere. But this is something that many of us could do. And it's a good thing, what Andrea's been talking about.
So frankly, what I frankly wonder about more and more is the top thing here, the Zimbabwe case. You know, Zimbabwe, total collapse, hyperinflation. The guy hung on at the age of 93. So Maduro still has a while to go. And honestly, I mean, the Zimbabwe case shows the country can literally go down the tubes big time, 5 times in a row, with a president who is totally not in control anymore, and the regime doesn't necessarily fall. So,
Until there's a split in the regime.
And Coffee, you had it.
Voy a hablar en español porque creo que hay una cuarta que no está allí, que es la invasión. ¿A qué me refiero? En estos días oímos a Ricardo Hausman, que es un economista venezolano de Harvard, diciendo que por qué Brasil no intervenía. La emigración de venezolanos a los países vecinos tiene muchas caras. Una cara es la creación de problemas para el empleo en los países, etcétera, y todo lo que es xenofobia que se puede generar en los países vecinos. Pero hay otra cosa que es muy importante. Estas personas que emigran, tienen que ver con lo que decía Kirk hace un momento, llevan cosas. Y entre las cosas que llevan malaria, llevan HIV-Sida, tuberculosis, difteria y otras cuantas cosas más. De tal manera que la explosión de estos problemas sanitarios en Venezuela ha creado un problema internacional que los países no han asumido. Para Brasil, para Colombia y para Guyana, la explosión de la malaria, que ha alcanzado niveles históricamente inexistentes en Venezuela, es una amenaza a la seguridad pública y personal de otros países. Entonces, no hay una intencionalidad en este proceso, sino que se ha ido gestando de una manera, vamos a llamarla natural o histórica, en la cual los intereses y la defensa de estos países pueden contribuir a crear un cuarto escenario, que es la invasión.
What does the panel respond to?
I know you're all being mean to Ricardo Hausman. That's okay to be mean to those Harvard economists, but yeah, it's another thing that could happen. I think you've given the reasons why it would happen, which is this is affecting other countries now, and once it does, this isn't something academic. They have to ensure the security of their own citizens. Mm-hmm. And so that again, that's another way out, that this will continue to spill over into other countries and that they'll do something, because they'll kind of have to.
I would call this target point.
Yeah, I don't know when it'll happen or what way. I think we all agree though that if things get that bad, we need to recognize that there are reasons to have multilateral military interventions that are very good. They save human lives, and so we do this sometimes. We intervene because too many people are going to die otherwise. And so it is possible, but I think we agree it would need to be multilateral. So certainly, I live in horror of this thought of the Trump administration doing something unilaterally, and I think we agree that would be very, very bad. Multilateral, yes, and only when we say this really is the only option now, because we're facing a lot of death, a lot of sickness, a lot of starvation.
So I think as again, anthropologist wannabe, I think I'm okay with not being neutral and asking the question of what, most of us Venezuelans have families, in my case, pretty much all my family in Venezuela. What would an invasion really look like, to those who have all of our families there? A military invasion, like I know there's the hardcore, I want to say Plan País policy experts that are like, well, the military invasion would be, the balance of power. But what would that really look like for us who send, money to Venezuela so that your grandma can get, la medicina para la hipertensión? I asked the same question of what would an oil embargo that would close the ports look like for us, the people who have family in Venezuela who send through Houston the cajita with all the medicine and the pañales, and what would that really look like? And is that what we're really advocating for? I'm not saying that I have the solution or the alternative or the $1 million question of what would be the alternative, but if those are our options on the table, then that is the worst. So those are the worst options for us who would have to deal with a military invasion. And maybe we should call our people in our brothers and sisters and elsewhere where they do live military occupation, and maybe the best case scenario would be Syria, Iraq, and I think honestly, if if D-Day, according to Hausman, really came, I think the one that would rejoice out of his grave would be Chavez, because that would then set, and leftist academics would rejoice as well, because then we would have a whole sort of set and array of publications that this is what we always, you know, predicted. So.
Let me make one more point from the perspective of somebody who knows Brazil better than Venezuela. Brazil would never, ever, just on its own, spearhead invasion or kind of military occupation of Venezuela. It's just not the way Brazil operates. Brazilian diplomacy is very anti-use of military force, partly because Brazilian diplomacy is always worried that the other Latin American countries see them as this overbearing hegemon, so they're very, very gun-shy in any use of kind of repression or military. So the only scenario where there could be some international intervention would be like serious unrest inside Venezuela, maybe like a failed military coup and you get practical civil war, or un estallido social, that really this whole place just blows up and it's just mass violence and looting, and the Venezuelan government can't get things under control. I think only then. So not like here's this country and there's an invasion, but this country is blowing up, and then the international community, you know, like Haiti, right? You have a sort of peacekeeping operation. That would be the only thing. But the trigger could never be sort of from the outside in. It would have to be that the country itself is just literally blowing up. I think it would be the only scenario which makes sense. We had a couple of people in the very back. So.
Bueno, pensaba un poco en los grupos paramilitares que se pudiesen formar, es la primera reflexión que tengo. Y la segunda, yo sí creo que se subestima un poco los esfuerzos que se han hecho. Yo no creo que se deba llamar oposición porque no es un gobierno democrático, creo que todos coinciden, creo que es un movimiento de resistencia, y cuando hay movimientos de resistencia, creo que hay muchos factores sociales que intervienen en ello. Y hay mucha gente que se puede ir, pero hay otra que definitivamente no, y cada vez menos. Porque nada más cruzar la frontera hasta Perú son $300. Y no todo el mundo tiene $300, ni hay suficientes extranjeros para mandar $300 a la cantidad de venezolanos para que se vayan por autobús por Colombia y suban hacia Perú, por decir un caso simplemente migratorio. Yo sí creo que también subestimamos la idea de que la oposición, líderes de oposición, si lo vemos, ya ha pasado 20 años, el Capriles o Leopoldo, que fundaron un movimiento que dio la alternativa a la ECOPEI en su momento, políticamente hablando, fue una alternativa y fue creciendo poco a poco, que ya también, por supuesto, el chavismo pues la arropó en su momento. Son movimientos, son alternativas políticas que se van dando. Yo sí creo que debe haber una nueva generación, que ya no es efectivamente ni Capriles ni Leopoldo, pero puede ser enriquecer otros figuras jóvenes que han estado padeciendo